Henry West wasn't the type of person who believed in magic. He had spent his adult life looking at code, troubleshooting virtual reality glitches, and trying to make sure the tech that people used to escape their mundane lives didn't become the very thing that ruined their reality. And yet, on that morning, as he sat in his cramped cubicle with a mug of burnt coffee in hand, staring at a flickering screen, he couldn't shake the sensation that something was off. It started with a call, the kind of call Henry got all the time. "Hello, this is Henry with the Virtual Realm support team. How can I help you today?" His voice was robotic, a well-practiced line he'd recited hundreds of times to customers calling about bugs, glitches, or frozen avatars. The voice on the other end was frazzled, almost panicked. "Oh my God, you have to help me. My house, something's wrong with my house. The walls, they're glitching." Henry sighed, adjusting his headset. "Ma'am, if your walls are glitching, I think you might want to check your VR setup, not your actual home." "No, no, no. You don't understand. It's like the whole house is warping. It's like a damn video game." Henry leaned back in his chair, rolling his eyes. "Okay, calm down. Let's start with some basic troubleshooting. Can you reset your router and—" "No, no, not the router. There's a creature coming out of the wall." "A creature?" Henry's fingers hovered over his keyboard. This was definitely one of those calls where someone had mixed up their VR experience with reality, maybe even gotten too immersed in their simulated world. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn off your VR headset for a moment. Let me help you sort this out." The woman's voice grew more frantic. "No. It's not the VR. It's coming out of the wall in my living room, and it—" Her voice cut out suddenly, replaced by static. Henry frowned, leaning closer to his screen. He pulled up the call log, about to disconnect and move on to the next customer, when the line crackled back to life. Henry, the woman's voice was now distorted, as if struggling against some sort of interference. "Oh my God, it's talking to me. Ma'am, I'm going to— the boundary is breaking," she said, her voice trembling. It said, "The boundary is breaking, Henry." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Henry felt his stomach drop. This wasn't the usual kind of call. "What do you mean, the boundary is breaking?" Before she could answer, there was a loud crash, followed by the sound of heavy breathing. The woman gasped. "Henry, it's here. It's real. It's real." Then, the call went silent. Henry sat frozen in his chair, staring at the dead phone line. His first instinct was to brush it off as a prank. It was just some glitchy customer trying to get attention, he told himself. Maybe she was playing around in a VR world and had gotten too deep into it. Maybe she was just trying to get a refund, but as he rubbed his eyes and returned to his work, a strange sense of unease settled over him. He looked down at the coffee cup in his hand. The liquid inside shifted oddly, rippling like a digital screen going out of sync. His stomach tightened. He shook his head and set the cup down, chalking it up to exhaustion. But when he turned his gaze to the screen, something caught his eye. A tiny error code flashed on his monitor, an anomaly, just like a glitch in a video game. But this wasn't normal, not at all. It was a string of symbols, not part of any known coding language he'd seen before. And then, almost imperceptibly, the words appeared, "Help us stabilize the borders before it's too late." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He leaned closer to the screen, his fingers hovering just above the keyboard. The message was gone as quickly as it had appeared, and for a moment, he wondered if he was just seeing things. He reached for his coffee again, but before his fingers touched the cup, the room around him flickered. It wasn't a flash or a light malfunction, it was more like the whole room had taken on the texture of a bad VR simulation, everything rippling, distorting, and then snapping back to normal. Henry pulled his hand back, eyes wide. What the hell was going on? He shook his head, standing up and stretching. Maybe he'd had too many late nights lately, too many hours spent hunched over his computer, dealing with technical support. Maybe it was time for a break. But something told him that this wasn't just another glitch. This was something far more serious. That he grabbed his jacket and walked out of his cubicle, determined to clear his head. The office was quiet for the most part. People were absorbed in their screens, typing away or taking calls, and Henry knew that no one else would notice anything unusual. But as he passed by the window, he froze. A giant, pixelated owl was perched on the fire escape outside the building. It was massive, its wings flapping in an unnatural way, the edges of its form flickering and distorting like it was made of faulty code. And then, just like that, it vanished, disappearing into thin air. Henry blinked, unsure of what he had just seen. He turned quickly and hurried down the stairs, his pulse racing. The next few days felt like a fever dream. The glitches started to get worse. People began reporting strange occurrences. A child's toy truck in the park suddenly sprouted wings and flew off, only to crash into the ground moments later. An old man at the corner cafe swore that a holographic dragon had appeared in his morning coffee, hovering over his mug, before vanishing when he tried to touch it. Henry had kept his head down, avoiding any further involvement in the cases. But then one night, after another restless shift at work, he received a call that changed everything. This time, it wasn't a customer. The voice on the other end was clear, direct, and familiar. "Henry," the voice said. "It's Valerie." Valerie. Henry hadn't heard from her in years. She had been one of his colleagues back in the early days of VR development. She had been brilliant, a visionary in her own right. But after a falling out over some of the ethical issues surrounding VR technology, she had left the industry. He hadn't kept in touch, but he never forgot her. "What's going on, Valerie?" Henry asked, his voice tight. "What do you know about these glitches? What the hell is happening?" "Meet me at the old research lab tomorrow night," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "I'll explain everything. And Henry, trust me, we're running out of time." Henry's heart skipped a beat. Valerie wasn't the type to call unless it was important. He agreed to meet her without a second thought, even though his mind raced with questions. What could she possibly know about the glitches? What was really happening? The next night, Henry arrived at the abandoned research facility, the cold air biting at his skin. Valerie was waiting for him outside, her face illuminated by the faint glow of the city lights. "We need to talk," she said quietly, leading him inside. "And you need to listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you could change everything." Valerie didn't waste time with pleasantries. She led Henry through the dusty, half-abandoned hallways of the old research facility. The building had been part of the early development stages for several VR technologies, but it had been shut down years ago after a series of experiments went wrong. Henry had always known there were stories about the place, stories of unauthorized tests, strange occurrences, and research projects that went off the rails. But he'd never paid much attention. He had his job, and the world of VR had never seemed all that dangerous to him. Until now, Valerie stopped in front of a nondescript door at the end of a narrow corridor. "In here," she said, her voice low, glancing over her shoulder as though someone might be listening. Henry followed her into the room, his steps echoing in the silence. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them off from the world outside. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with rows of old monitors, broken equipment, and a few discarded chairs. But there was something in the air, something he couldn't quite place. It was a mix of static, like the feeling you get when a screen flickers out of sync, and something else. Something electric. "Valerie, what's going on?" Henry asked, his patience thinning. "What do you know about these glitches? These creatures that keep popping into the real world? What's happening?" Valerie turned to face him, her expression serious. Her eyes, once full of idealism and drive, now carried a weight of something darker, something heavy. "It's the boundary," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The boundary between our world and the virtual one. It's breaking. And I think I know why. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. He opened his mouth to speak but stopped. Valerie wasn't the type to exaggerate. If she said something was happening, it was happening. I've been tracking it for months, Valerie continued, pacing the small room as she spoke. At first, it was just small things, glitches in the system, random errors that didn't make sense. But then, it escalated. It started happening outside of VR, Henry. In the real world. Henry ran a hand through his hair. The glitches, the creatures? You think that's connected to some kind of system failure? No. I think it's something else, Valerie said, stopping and looking Henry directly in the eyes. Something intentional. Intentional? Henry repeated, his voice rising. Are you telling me someone is behind this? That this isn't just some accidental bug in the system? Valerie nodded, her gaze hardening. Yes. I've been trying to figure out who, but it's all connected to a project. A project that was supposed to revolutionize VR, Project Mirage. Henry's brow furrowed. Project Mirage? That's the prototype for the next generation simulation, right? The one that was supposed to make VR so immersive it felt like real life? Yes, but it wasn't just about making VR more immersive. It was supposed to. Valerie stopped herself, as if weighing her words carefully. It was supposed to merge the digital world with the physical one. Henry felt his pulse quicken. Merge the two? That's insane. If you start combining virtual reality with the real world, exactly. It wasn't meant to be a game anymore, Valerie interrupted. It was supposed to be something else entirely. Something beyond our control. Henry shook his head in disbelief. But how does that explain the creatures? The glitches? The stuff that's spilling over into reality? That's the problem, Valerie said, her voice barely above a whisper. Project Mirage wasn't just a simulation. It was a living, evolving system. And when they started pushing it too far, the code became unstable. But instead of crashing, like it should have, it fractured, creating tears between the two worlds. That's what's causing the glitches. The creatures are just the beginning. The room seemed to shrink around Henry as the weight of Valerie's words settled on him. His mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. It was too much, too fast. But there was one thing he couldn't ignore, the message. The warning. Help us stabilize the borders before it's too late. So these things, Henry started, his voice uncertain, these things coming into the real world, they're not just accidents. No, Valerie said, her expression grim. They're side effects of the fracture. The more the system destabilizes, the more these virtual creatures slip through. They're not just glitching out of the program, Henry. They're entering reality. And if we don't stop it soon, both worlds, this world, and the virtual one, will collapse together. Henry's mind reeled. You're telling me, this isn't a bug? This isn't just a matter of cleaning up some corrupted files? The whole world could collapse? Valerie nodded. That's exactly what I'm saying. Henry's hands clenched into fists at his sides. How do we stop it? Valerie looked at him, her face drawn with exhaustion. We need to get into the core. The core? Henry echoed. What's that? It's where the heart of Project Mirage was developed, Valerie explained. It's a hidden facility underneath the city, where they were testing the most advanced aspects of the technology. That's where the rift began. The only way to fix it is to go in and shut it down at the source. Henry stared at her, unsure whether he could believe what she was saying. He had worked with VR for years, fixed countless problems, but nothing had ever been like this. The thought of stepping into the heart of a system that was literally tearing apart the fabric of reality was terrifying. But there was no time to waste. They had to do something. All right, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos spinning in his head. Let's go. Show me the way. Valerie led him out of the room and down another long corridor. The air felt colder now, almost electrically charged. As they walked, Henry felt like they were stepping deeper into a place that didn't belong in the real world anymore. The building had been abandoned for years, but the lights flickered to life as they passed, casting strange shadows on the walls. It felt like they weren't alone. Finally, they reached an elevator at the end of the hall. Valerie punched in a code on the panel, and the doors slid open with a soft hum. The elevator descended in silence, the walls flashing past, until the floor beneath them seemed to drop away entirely. The doors opened into a vast underground complex. It was everything Henry had imagined the core to be: cold, sterile, and far too advanced for any of them to truly understand. The walls were lined with glass panels, revealing rows of dormant machinery and blinking servers. This was where the bleeding edge of technology had been developed, where reality and simulation had collided. But there was something else. As Henry stepped into the room, he felt the air shift, the temperature drop. Something was off, something in the system wasn't right. The walls seemed to ripple, and the once static machinery hummed with life, as though waiting for something. Valerie led him to a central control console. The screen flickered as it powered on, revealing lines of code streaming across the monitor. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, like the heart of a living thing, pulsing with information. "This is it," Valerie said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We're at the source. Now we have to stop it." Henry's fingers hovered over the console. He didn't know what to do, how to fix this, but he knew one thing: they didn't have much time. The creatures were still slipping through. The code was unstable. And the fracture between the two worlds was only getting wider. Before he could act, a figure appeared on the screen, a face distorted by static. It was an avatar, but not like any avatar Henry had ever seen. It was an unsettling, garbled version of someone he recognized. "Welcome, Henry," the figure said, its voice distorted but familiar. "I've been waiting for you." The distorted face on the screen flickered, then solidified into something more familiar, too familiar. Henry's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the figure. It was Dr. Cameron Wilde, the lead scientist behind Project Mirage, the very man who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances years ago. "Dr. Wilde?" Henry's voice trembled, though he couldn't understand why. The man had been gone for years, a ghost in the corporate world, blamed for the collapse of the original Mirage project. And yet here he was, staring out from the screen like he was alive and well, his image flickering in and out of focus. "Welcome, Henry," Dr. Wilde repeated, his voice now eerily calm. "I've been waiting for you." Henry's breath caught in his throat. What is this? Where are you? How are you even?" The figure on the screen smiled, though it was hard to tell if it was a smile or just the way the image flickered. "I'm everywhere now, Henry. I've transcended. The project has transcended. We've moved past the boundaries you still hold on to." This, Dr. Wilde gestured at the screen with a flourish, his digital hands warping slightly with every motion. "This is the future." Valerie stepped forward, her face hardening. "You can't be serious. This is madness. The project was supposed to enhance human experience, not merge realities. You've created a disaster." Dr. Wilde's laugh was distorted, a mixture of static and humor that didn't sound right. "A disaster? No, Valerie. What you call a disaster is the natural progression of evolution. You see, the borders between the physical and virtual worlds were always an illusion. We created the illusion of separation, but there is no real divide. That's what Project Mirage has revealed. This merging is only the beginning." Henry felt the cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. The man in front of him, if you could even call him a man anymore, wasn't interested in fixing the problem. He had orchestrated this. All the glitches, the creatures slipping through, the system's falling apart. It was all part of Wilde's grand design. You, Henry's voice cracked as he tried to speak. You're the one behind all of this? You've been manipulating the system, breaking the boundaries? Not breaking them, Wilde replied. Revealing them. The boundaries between your world and mine are merely the first step. Imagine what humanity could achieve if the two realities merged. No more separation. No more limits. We could live forever, Henry. In both worlds. In all worlds. Stop it, Valerie interrupted, her fists clenched. This isn't progress. This is chaos. The system can't handle it. If you keep pushing this, both worlds will collapse. It's already happening. Don't you see that? Wilde's distorted face softened, though his words remained chillingly calm. You don't understand, Valerie. It's already begun. The collapse isn't something I fear. It's inevitable. I have already transcended the boundaries, just like Project Mirage was always meant to do. The future is now. Henry's head swam with the implications. His hands gripped the sides of the console, his mind racing. What Wilde was saying was worse than any glitch or malfunction. He wasn't just breaking the system, he was rewriting reality itself. If Project Mirage succeeded, if Wilde had his way, there would be no separation between what was real and what was simulated. The two worlds would collapse together into a singular, fractured existence. Valerie's voice was tight with panic, but there was a defiance in it that Henry admired. You're insane, Wilde. You've destroyed everything. You can't just merge two worlds like this. People will die. The creatures, they are not creatures, Wilde cut her off, his image flickering again. They are the next step in evolution. They are real. They are real, Valerie. Do you not understand? The boundaries you cling to are a limitation. But now, the two worlds are intertwined, and I am the one who controls them both. Henry felt a sudden surge of rage. Wilde had always been a brilliant scientist, but this was something else. This was madness. The man standing, or existing, in front of them was no longer human. He was a parasite, feeding on the very essence of reality, manipulating it for his own twisted vision. He had brought about the collapse on purpose, and now, with each passing moment, the world was slipping further into his control. We have to stop him, Henry said, his voice firm. We can't let this continue. Valerie nodded sharply. But how? The system is falling apart. We're running out of time. We don't have a choice, Henry replied, stepping forward to the console. I'm going to shut it down. He didn't know how he would do it, didn't know what would happen when he tried, but he knew it was their only option. The entire system was built on a delicate network of code. If he could break it, disrupt the core functions, maybe they could stop Wilde's madness. He had to try, but before he could act, Wilde's image on the screen shifted, and the room suddenly grew colder. The air itself seemed to ripple as the lights flickered above them. You think you can stop me? Wilde's voice was no longer distorted, but deep and resonant, as if echoing from the walls themselves. I am already in your world, Henry. You cannot stop what has already begun. The room seemed to stretch, warping as if it, too, was becoming part of the virtual world. Henry's vision blurred, and the walls started to pulse with unnatural light. The boundaries between reality and the digital realm were disintegrating. The world was breaking apart around him. Valerie, he said, his voice rising in urgency. We need to go, now. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm and pulled him away from the console. The room seemed to warp even more, the edges of the walls flickering like a bad television signal. Everything, was starting to glitch, but as they reached the door, something stepped through it. Something monstrous. A creature, massive, black and shimmering, like a collection of broken pixels, stood in the doorway, blocking their escape. Its eyes were too bright, too real. Henry felt his stomach churn as it cocked its head, its form rippling like a mirage. It was alive. It was real. And it wasn't the only one. The walls began to shimmer, and more creatures appeared, their forms bleeding through the cracks in reality. They were coming from every direction, pouring out of the virtual world like a flood. Some looked like animals, others were humanoid, but all of them were unsettlingly familiar, as though they had been plucked straight from Henry's past experiences in VR. The creatures circled them, watching with glowing eyes. One of them, an enormous, jagged figure with tendrils for arms, moved closer, its voice distorted but somehow clear. "You cannot escape," it hissed, the words seeping into Henry's mind. "The world is merging, and you will be part of it." Valerie drew a weapon, a small, sleek device from her pocket, and pointed it at the creature. It emitted a high-pitched whine, a pulse of energy that shot toward the creature, sending it crashing backward, its form flickering out of existence for a moment before it reappeared, more solid than before. "Get to the elevator," Valerie shouted, pulling Henry toward the door. "We have to get to the backup system. It's our only chance." The creatures pressed closer, but Valerie's pulse weapon kept them at bay, flashing with each strike. Henry could feel the air thickening, the world becoming more unstable by the second. Every step he took felt like he was walking through a dream, and he could barely make sense of his surroundings anymore. Reality was slipping away. They reached the elevator, and Valerie slammed her hand on the button. The doors opened, but there was no guarantee the elevator would take them anywhere safe. The whole facility was falling apart. The walls were alive with static. The creatures were moving faster now, closing in. Henry gripped Valerie's arm, his mind racing. What if it's too late? What if we can't fix this? "We have to try," Valerie said, her voice tight, determined. "We're the only ones who can." The doors of the elevator closed, but the creatures were too close. As the elevator descended, Henry heard their haunting, distorted voices echoing in the chamber above them, growing fainter with each passing moment. The floor below them hummed with energy, the air charged with electricity. They were close. So close. But Henry couldn't shake the feeling that, even if they stopped wild, even if they somehow managed to fix the system, the damage was already done. Reality was already too far gone. There would be no going back. And then, with a sudden jolt, the elevator stopped.